Oh god, the fucking Hoppians. These guys are the main reason Heretic and I even wrote this essay. Now, this may be the first time which Heretic and I have both really taken an in-depth stab at the principal underpinning of Hoppe's ideas. Not the first time. I'm sure most of you watching know that either of us have openly expressed criticism towards his philosophy, but the first time that we've proofed an essay for all of the annoying logical fallacies and disingenuous tactics which Hoppe's followers use to hand-wave away criticism of Hoppe's ideas, without actually addressing the points raised by his critics.
This chapter is not about Hans Hermann Hoppe himself, but his followers, hereby referred to as Hoppians. I want to make the distinction that unless specified otherwise, any criticism of Hoppians is not a criticism of Hoppe. It is no more reasonable to hold him accountable for the actions of those who subscribe to his philosophy any more than it is to claim Marilyn Manson is responsible for the Columbine shooting. Unfortunately, we can't ignore the issue related to Hoppe's followers, as they are actually very important to understanding arguably the biggest problem with Hoppianism. They're the canary in the coal mine for what happens when a reader internalizes Hoppe's ideas without questioning their shortcomings or contradictions.
This should go without saying based on the sheer fact that we dedicated an entire section of our essay just to Hoppe's followers, but there are a whole host of problems unique specifically to common trends in their behavior and how they propagate their ideas. The reason I mention this is because I'm sure a lot of people, when they first saw that we had a section dedicated to quote-unquote Hoppians, might have been to assume that Heretic and I are really going to spend a whole chapter generalizing an entire sub-community of the libertarian movement by essentially nutpicking. However, after reading more of Hoppe's work to inform our research on this video, we came to recognize that these common trends of behavior we'd identified long ago can actually be traced back to the logical conclusions of following how Hoppe attempts to restructure the framework and assumptions of libertarian philosophy for his specific approach to trying to explain the various subjects we'd covered earlier in this essay.
Libertarianism have failed, with the exception of a few pro-marijuana laws. Lately, I've been contemplating why that's the case. Why libertarians suck so much at convincing others to adopt individualist thinking. And the conclusion that I came to is that collectivism is simply superior to individualism.
Libertarians tend to take it too far, though. They tend to want no government involved, no nothing, just wild people. You're an anarchist, right?
Well, I used to describe myself that way, but I don't anymore, because I don't think that there's no lack of control in a privatized society.
Parasitic economic authoritarians such as communists will always exist, and as a result must be violently suppressed by any available means in order to secure economic liberty. This is also true of cultural busybodies, whether it be evangelical Christians insisting on maintaining failed prohibition-era legislation, or, genderqueer college students, trying to mandate affirmative action. Some people, majority leftists, just refuse to respect non-aggression and property rights. And that's fine. I have no problem committing myself to ensuring their oppression. I think it's a perfectly libertarian position to hold.
What would you call someone's political philosophy that places the family as the smallest and most important unit in society, who believes social order must be imposed from the top down, that people must be coerced into following strict cultural norms identified as tradition, in attempting to establish something called a natural order governed over by a natural aristocracy, a cabal of elites naturally selected to rule over society, which is often described in paternalistic terms, where all of society is the dominion of one person who is free to remove people from society for any reason they see fit, even employing violent aggression against otherwise peaceful people if it is arbitrarily deemed to be necessary, and disrespects even elementary concepts of property rights such as contract law or right of way, where those in this society are demanded to spy upon their neighbors to ensure they are not engaged in bad behaviors or beliefs that makes appeals to preserving nations or cultures to justify government-imposed restrictions on free association, and dehumanizes people completely arbitrarily to justify infringing on their rights, up to and including enslaving and murdering them? That all of this is absolutely essential, otherwise a social order is utterly impossible? This sounds fascistic, doesn't it? Not just the Antifa, he's a fascist, anyone who disagrees with me kind, either. As an unironic, Oswald Mosley, Benito Mussolini-style authoritarian fascism. Yet those who hold these beliefs unironically think themselves anarchists. It's a cognitive dissonance between simultaneously holding structuralist and methodological individualist beliefs that gets resolved one way or another. Those that fall into structuralism become statists. Who can blame them? They took these fundamentally authoritarian assumptions about social and economic relationships and took them to their logical conclusion. It's a process that's been repeated innumerable times. A principled or otherwise knowledgeable anarchist starts reading Hans Hermann Hoppe and internalizes his narratives about argumentation ethics, secessionism, neo-feudalism, the natural order, proprietarianism, unilateral contract theory, and structuralist cultural norms, more than likely having been suggested to read his work. That these clearly subversive narratives definitively explain anarchy and property ethics somehow, then they become statists. It's a process I call going full Hoppian. It begins with unironically arguing in favor of political action, such as secessionism, or in favor of political candidates who use rhetoric about tradition or limited government, arguing that they are property rights supporters. Support for these candidates, or any other statist or even collectivist cause, is identified as pragmatism. Pragmatism is, of course, a meaningless term that can be used to arbitrarily justify literally anything that the speaker happens to like. For example, overtly recommending government policy as a pragmatic methodology to achieving anarchism, a state in which there would be no government policy. As though the step were a more expedient or efficient method of achieving a goal compared to the alternative. However, no proof is ever presented towards this, such as how regressing to absolute monarchies or feudalism are pragmatic steps towards anarchism, how we need to back the blue or similar bootlicking slogans to express support for legislation enforcers using government violence to suppress political opponents. It's pragmatic, you see. This process of going full Hoppian ends with the Hoppian self-identifying as a statist of some form, either a neo-Confederate, a monarchist, or a fascist, once it becomes clear to the Hoppian that they have no way of conceptually refuting political rule. At that point, they're an anarchist the same way Marxists are anarchists, in the latter's desire to implement a dictatorship of the proletariat as a pragmatic step to achieving anarchism. In other words, they're confused. For the longest time, this process has absolutely baffled me. I've read Hoppe too, but I didn't get it. What is it about it that makes it so persuasive, that corrupts otherwise solid, principled anarchists into literal authoritarians like freaking clockwork? After a lot of consideration, I believe we've figured it out. But here's another question. Where do we start?
Well, let's start by looking at some of the more common ways in which people are methodically propagandized in our society, and then compare this to Hoppe's slant on libertarianism. I highly doubt that anyone watching this video would recognize the way people are taught to view the state and social structures in government schools as anything other than cult-like brainwashing. So I will use the Prussian model of education as my example. When people are being enrolled into a government school, they're going to be about 4 or 5 years old. At this point in your life, and for roughly the next 5 to 7 years, you're just beginning to develop an understanding of yourself, how you generally are going to go about meeting your own interests, how to use information as a way to build your own path to achieving said interests, and so on. This is why the government's curriculum for this period of time tends to focus on very basic subjects like math, social skills, and language conventions, which one could use to develop their conceptual understanding and the basis for that understanding of most subjects with, along with precisely why the curriculums attempt to establish a very rigid set of parameters for what is or is not acceptable, because people at this age aren't being given skills to develop themselves as individuals, along with evaluating and identifying their own interests. They're being essentially programmed to have a very deeply ingrained internal set of interests that they can have, and ways that they could go about meeting those interests, and if they think differently, they're punished. Then, of course, around age 12, around the time where one starts being able to develop a more abstract, nuanced interpretation of the world, the curriculums begin focusing on civics, history, and other very empirical or information-based ways of approaching the construction of one's worldview. And wouldn't you know it, just like the aptly titled primary school's curriculum, all of these subjects are framed in a way to conform to what the state taught about how one needs to go about trying to achieve their interests, and what the right or wrong ways of doing so are, along with punishing people who ask the wrong questions about the state's narrative of society and history. So, what does this have even remotely to do with Hoppe and Hoppians? Well, the way that Hoppe's philosophy is presented to a libertarian audience, what he claims to be trying to demonstrate, what he claims the role of his work in both the Austrian methodology and libertarianism is, along with the way he consciously restructures the core premises of the principles he refers to without noting this or justifying why he thinks that it would be better to reconceptualize how these principles explain themselves, create a dialectic which causes Hoppians to inherently view any critics as opponents and opponents as threats to their interests, regardless of what their criticism is or how they go about explaining their concerns. We've already explained in great detail what these subversions to libertarian philosophy Hoppe introduces are, but you'll notice that all of them combined create a sort of Hegelian propaganda model, where Hoppe presents what he proposes as the identification of a problem with libertarian principles which either don't exist or overemphasize the importance of a long-refuted criticism to libertarian philosophy in order to manufacture a sense of necessity for whatever new claim Hoppe is attempting to introduce as an expansion upon the supposedly flawed aspects of libertarianism. This makes even the mere notion of being critical of Hoppe's ideas to his followers comparable to being critical of libertarianism, because in order for libertarianism to be coherent within this new framework that Hoppe has constructed, Hoppe's subversions to libertarianism are necessary. Not to mention that Hoppe's subversions, together, especially the structuralist interpretation of society and the notion that a libertarian society has to have law imposed from the top down by an organization which has a total monopoly on all resources, all construct a pretty clear positive association, not only with political authority, but specifically neo-reactionary views, which is why Hoppians do go full Hoppe. They always become either a monarchist, some form of white nationalist, or neo-Confederates. So, Hoppians like to dismiss people such as Cantwell or that guy T as outliers, and insist that there isn't any sort of obvious logical progression inherent to Hoppe's ideas which would lead one to developing their views. However, as you all can clearly see, there very obviously is. But regardless, it's not even really that Hoppians don't see the issues, which Heretic and I have highlighted previously. It's that from their perspective, acknowledging them is perceived as an attack against the foundation of their view of the world, and consequently their interests as people, which causes them to engage in cognitive dissonance in order to protect it. So, in much the same way that government schools and state media brainwashes people into believing that they're dependent upon state-imposed policy in order to have their interests met, therefore becoming emotionally invested in state policy proposals as a result, Hoppians, for lack of a better term, have been systematically brainwashed into associating Hoppe's overtly authoritarian views in everything but name with libertarian principles, and an affirmation of natural law theory. This is the reason as well why Hoppians tend to become extremely toxic towards anyone who criticizes Hoppe's arguments and generally attempt to ascribe anti-property or a Marxian foundation to their position. When, in reality, as Heretic and I demonstrated in the previous chapter, Hoppe's arguments for natural law and libertarianism make property claims arbitrary in the same way that frameworks which use political authority as the basis for their claims. And Hoppe's view of how societies are structured, his narrative of history, and his view of markets share multiple striking similarity to Marx's, most notably the natural aristocracy compared to Marx's capitalist class within his material dialectic. In fact, let's just briefly go over a collection of various hot takes we've gathered from Hoppians in the wild.
And this is the first one we're looking at.
I mean, it shouldn't be hard to believe these are, Hoppian posts, given that the chat of this stream is worse than some of the comments we're going to be going over already. Man.
Yeah, this person claims they're an anarchist and still claims that they're an anarchist. It's someone you've probably heard of, but for the privacy, I'm not going to say who it is. Oh, how did that get there?
Voltaire.
Whoops! I seem to have accidentally let that in here.
I haven't even read it yet. I just Voltaire. I know it's gonna be good.
If you want libertarian ideals to survive, you might not want to advocate government bringing in people who hate those ideals and want them destroyed. Who does this? Next one right now. Yeah. Reminder that deontological ethics don't exist and nobody is bound to them. The only ethics that would be objective would be those that come from God.
Oh God. He literally says unleash the police like Rothbard did in that one neo-reactionary essay he wrote later in his life.
Donald Trump needs to declare himself a dictator. After witnessing the violence in Minneapolis, no Democrat should ever be allowed to hold power ever again.
Full Hoppian.png.
So this is one involving you. So literally, your only problem with social contract theory is that there isn't an actual contract? Yes! Now, this is reiterating what you said before. From your perspective, you don't even have an argument against taxation. Break snap. And Kane says, yes, you can. Yeah, I do. I didn't sign a contract, therefore it breaks the nap.
And then I replied jokingly, yes, you did. You signed the U.S. covenant by associating with the U.S. covenant community. Enjoy your Marxist propaganda, you hoppophobe. What?
Oh, I think we would recognize this pretty quickly.
This is what I was talking about earlier. No, I'm not going to apologize. Hoppe is way worse than even I initially thought. And that's the ultimate irony is, I'd read bits of Democracy, the God That Failed. I read a few essays. Those admittedly were like my biggest issues with Hoppe going into my research about Hoppe's work and coming out. I don't even think this guy, there's no chance he is well-intentioned. He's just a neo-reactionary who slapped the libertarian label on his philosophy. Well, and that's the irony, is they're claiming you didn't read enough of Hoppe to understand, and I mean, yeah, that's true, but not in the way that you intended.
Now, this one is hilarious.
How to determine if someone is a libertarian or a lulbert? What's your opinion on Hoppe?
This is actually completely true, just not in the way that this person intends. Oh, this one is... This guy is a legend. Let's see if I can zoom in a bit, because
the Nazi flag and everything. Yeah.
This is
if you still weren't convinced that Hoppians were obviously proponents of political rule, now they're unironically using the old statist canards, which any true libertarian would laugh off and not take to be a serious issue. What happens when you look at society and social conventions and interests of different people interacting as something that needs to be imposed onto them? you start having problems understanding how people can build roads, and then you end up becoming some sort of neo-reactionary statist.
All right, now here's another one. The monarch is simply a private property owner. Anarcho-capitalism is compatible with monarchism, so to speak.
And if we're going to be completely honest, that's, my biggest issue with Hoppians, just aside from the fact that they're not libertarians trying to co-opt libertarianism, is the fact that they use these weaselly, actively disingenuous argumentative tactics, and it comes off like they're being consciously malicious.
Next. Oh, this is very interesting. Oh, this one is just a meme.
Yeah.
Now here's one. Someone was taking something I said. I remember this. I was making an argument about trying to clarify my position on borders, and my point is that both, like, any form of statist borders, whether they be open borders, closed borders, or some form of like passports, selection, quota, whatever borders, are illegitimate. And that's basically all I said. And he was trying to make the argument that I'm for closed borders too, which, yeah. Let's see, is the next one? Yeah, here's more of that comment.
This is very simple to understand, guys. If you build a fence around someone's property and then claim that they need your permission to cross the fence, that's an act of aggression. You're using force against them to claim ownership over their property effectively.
You can use property in very predatory ways. I'm surprised that this kind of thing is very difficult for them. And here's more of that comment, them taking it completely out of context.
We called it exclusive ownership, therefore it has to be legitimate. Yeah, and the amazing thing is, like, they don't, like, they seem to look at this as if it's, like, taking away from the like, as if this is an argument against property. No, that's an act of self-defense. This is an actual argument for property rights. Your position, the idea that if you exclusively own something, don't ever debate about, what rightfully can be owned. Don't ever ask that question. That's an anti-property position.
So next.
Oh God, what is this?
Oh, I remember this. This is a comment someone made in reply to Roderick Long in his essay replying to argumentation ethics. Hoppe is very clear about protecting individual rights, which is why left libertarians have to take their shots.
No, we could take their shots without even addressing his arguments, because his arguments are dumb. Now, if you're particularly observant, you might have noticed this already, but Hoppians use many of the same rhetorical tactics employed by Marxists in order to defend their expansions upon the libertarian philosophy. Perhaps the most obvious example of this is when talking about Hoppianism and covenant communities, the whole "a CC is just an informal association of property owners," while simultaneously advocating strict contractual rules enforced by an entity which has an exclusive ownership claim over everything that you have to justify yourself every time you want to do anything. Shtick we touched upon earlier with how Hoppians use equivocation to stop people from questioning their property ethics. You've all probably heard this exact same argument from a Marxist beat for beat, just using different terminology. I live under what you would call capitalism, and people still do that with people in their community all the time. It sounds like you're purposely conflating your position with positive social behavior to make your detractors and critics look bad, while simultaneously advocating quote-unquote socialism as a rigid economic state-imposed structure of fiat, which is arguably just an even more onerous form of feudalism. Well, there's a reason for this. That's because, much like Karl Marx, who quite openly employs a Hegelian propaganda model in his philosophy specifically to cause people to become emotionally invested in his philosophy, or as he called it, class conscious, and whose philosophy emerged conveniently right around the time that proponents of communalism within libertarian and socialist circles had fallen out of favor, since at the time it was widely recognized that monopolies unjust property relations, and general forms of anti-competitive, privileged features of the market in a state society couldn't exist without some form of state intervention. And as was seen by the ethical and praxis failures of the Owenite communities, so-called libertarians who thought of themselves as opponents of the right to exclusively own one's resources and associate freely were recognized rightfully as actually being advocates of a more radical form of state dominion over resources and central proprietorship than even defenders of the monarchies in Europe at the time were. So Marx came along, and through Olympic-level mental gymnastics, several loans worth the modern equivalent of millions of dollars from Nathan Rothschild, along with direct financial support from one of the wealthiest British industrialists of the 19th century, published several works, perhaps most famous, Capital, in which he fundamentally lays the groundwork for how none of the aforementioned problems with socialism or libertarian philosophers that attempted to deny exclusive ownership claims actually exist. It's not actually state intervention which is causing the issues they rage about, nor are states inherently coercive. It's actually capitalists as a class, which the state created. So everything the state does, the capitalists are actually doing by influencing the state to allow them to influence the state. Unless they aren't, in which case the state is actually the capitalist class, and simultaneously in conflict with the capitalist class, because it's doing bad things which are all mean and capitalist-y. What's the capitalist class? Not the working class. What's the working class? Not the capitalist class. And also, every single person either has capitalist or working interests, and don't have any of their own unique individual interests. And just like that, suddenly the idea of a monopoly emerging out of a market free of intervention wasn't something that would get you laughed out of a special ed classroom, and the property relations of the current society were a natural product of exclusive ownership and actual decentralization. Freedom from state tyranny was just having a state own everything, but call it democracy or collective ownership. Also, just as a quick side note, the terms socialist and capitalist prior to Marxist theory had an entirely different connotation because of the fact that before Marx, no one in their right mind would have associated systemic anti-competitive practices, political authority, and monopoly with the market, since political literature published by states during the early to mid-19th century openly promoted the association between states causing monopolies or depriving people of the ability to freely associate, along with becoming more dependent on state-supported industry as the state's supposed benefit on society. Capitalism was a derogatory term used to refer to state-sponsored industrialists, and socialism was a general term used to refer to anyone who is skeptical of the modern state's political economies, which would have included many liberals and libertarians who are now associated with what's referred to as free market anarchy or just laissez-faire argumentation. But the reason I bring this up is because this is remarkably similar to the influence Hoppe has had on modern libertarianism and the Austrian methodology. Not just how he preys upon desperate demographics looking to justify their authoritarian tendencies they'd previously thought they'd need to toss aside in order to accept libertarianism as being true, or libertarians who don't know much about libertarianism and are simply looking for answers to questions they might have, but how he so specifically targets philosophical underpinnings key to libertarianism, which make people more susceptible to coming to inconsistent and or anti-libertarian conclusions by developing a warped idea of property ethics and principles, but also how Hoppe completely tries to ignore or undermine the fact that he's even espousing an entirely different view on libertarian philosophy from other libertarians. Even though to the trained eye it's patently obvious that he is, as Heretic and I have demonstrated, and how he uses equivocation to associate his covenant communities with decentralization and free association, or how Hoppians use euphemisms to try and softball positions which they consciously recognize as being woefully inconsistent, such as physical removal to describe using violence against thought criminals, or following up every one of these euphemisms euphemisms with the phrase "so to speak" as if to give themselves an out in case someone were to criticize them for their open support of the use of state violence, while pretending to be libertarians, in much the same way that Marxists talk about re-education centers, which counter-revolutionaries will have to be rehabilitated in if they espouse subversive opinions about their Marxist working-class people's anarcho-liberation state and be forced voluntarily into freedom slavery.
This equivocation of libertarianism with neo-reactionary views makes libertarianism antagonistic to those with personal, political, or even racial opposition to neo-reactionaries. After all, who would want to work with the guys who want to throw you out of helicopters? Libertarianism's greatest strength is its ability to appeal to every preference simultaneously, and Hoppeism narrows its appeal to exclusively the alt-right, who reject libertarianism to begin with out of principle. Libertarians, meanwhile, recognize everything we've discussed previously about Hoppeism, that it's a subversive, authoritarian framework for understanding social relations that seeks to impose social order and cultural norms from the top down. Just look at Hoppian memes, where they themselves depict the society they want to build as a prison. Is it no wonder that those who uncritically embrace Hoppe and his brand of anarcho-statism go statist? Suffice to say, never go full Hoppian.